So I'm gonna come at this from quite a different perspective, which I hope you'll see in the end. These are complementary, but I really wanted to give a little bit of background for how I think about data and why I think this topic that we're talking about today is so important. And I want to start this by saying explicitly that if we're talking about data and data use, I do think we have an obligation to collect and use data in an ethically and privacy sensitive manner to fulfill or to contribute to the public good. I also want to fully acknowledge that what I just said, both the ethically and privacy sensitive manner and public good are pretty amorphous concepts, and that reasonable people might define those quite a bit differently. So I think that that tension is probably pretty important for the topic of this session. And then in addition to that, I just want to talk for a couple minutes about broader social changes that I think are changing the way that we understand and interact with data. So I think probably all of us recognize we're in a time of rapid change with a lot of changes in digital technology, which really comes about in part because there's accessible storage, computing power, and proliferation of data. I mean, some of that computing power is exactly what Lee would be using with his colleagues to develop the technology he's talking about. And people have talked about data even as much as the exhaust of everyday life. And there's also a lot of increasingly opaque analytics, including artificial intelligence, that are dominated by small number of large corporations. So this rapid change and probably what will amount to a fundamental transition has been described as a fourth industrial revolution. So if you think about the first three industrial revolutions, we went through mechanization, which was aided by steam, mass production, which was aided by electricity, automation, which was aided by computers, and now this fourth transition has been described as a time of blurring the lines between physical, digital, and biological spheres. So, and because we're in the midst of this transition, it can be sometimes really difficult to see what the implications are of what's happening. But I think we all experience the ubiquity of data collection. And you think about healthcare system or Fitbits or even our cars and even refrigerators now are collecting data. And we also, of course, experience targeted advertising, talking devices, digital reminders. If you do anything on the internet, you get chased around by the last thing that you searched on Google. Some of these experiences are helpful and others are unexpected and sometimes they're downright creepy. So more things are automated or at least computer enabled, and it doesn't seem like the pace of anything is slowing down. So this has implications for every part of society. So education, cities, climate, global relations, and we can think about the impact on digital divide and things like that as well. And I think we also have to acknowledge, of course, the pandemic and the effects on thinking about these issues and related issues, and particularly about equity and the fact of what it means to collect data and use data. So regardless of your perspective, the underlying commonality is that we're all living in a data-driven world, and one that some authors have referred to as a new frontier for colonization. In some sense, I think this is about ourselves becoming part of the commodity and the commodification things. So private companies, multinational corporations, local and national governments all collect data about us and they're used to provide services, but they also obviously have the potential to be used for less positive things as well. So that's the fundamental challenge. There's potential both for good and bad. And the fact that sunlight is the best disinfectant, meaning that we can't identify oppression or systemic racism or any other form of negative outcome without data, but that lies uneasily and undoubtedly alongside the notion of a desire for the right to be left alone, right to privacy. So data on race, as just one example, are necessary, but can at the to expose racism of a systemic nature, but can at the very same time be used to perpetuate that discrimination. So I don't think we're going to necessarily answer all these issues or questions today, but I did think it was important to kind of think about that broader change and the ubiquity of data, as we think about what that means for data sovereignty and how we deal with sensitive information. So, and I think that's kind of the lead into the question that I'll turn back to Lee, which is, what do you mean by sovereignty?
Oh, yeah, thanks for asking that. For me, sovereignty, it's a colonial term in many respects that has to do with governance. But the notion that I kind of work with came out of an academic paper, which I'm not citing here, but I read it during the I Don't Know More and movement, or the beginning of it. And the notion was that each of us are sovereign as individuals in our relationship to creation, and we're all here with a sense of purpose, which is a sort of perennial indigenous concept. And I guess this is what we're looking at in terms of how we use what I'll call indigenous consensus protocols or indigenous protocols as a framework for ethics, interoperable framework for ethics. And so in that system, as I understand it, essentially those protocols are defined by our belonging to a group of people, be it a house, a clan, to a family. And this is something we can probably we all have an experience of, I certainly hope. And some of us have an identification and belonging to organizations, professional groups. And all of these have their protocols for belonging. And those are based on standards, essentially. And we're held accountable to those. So at the core of this notion of sovereignty is a sense of personal responsibility to our collective. And in collectivist cultures, that is the driving sort of belonging and contributing to the collective is essentially the principal behavior and motivation, which is separate to the modernist notion of selfish self-interest. So sovereignty, I'd say, is our individual responsibility to bring our gifts to the world, put them to the marketplace of human interaction in each moment, and try and do so in a good way. And I'm getting a thumbs up from Kelly, which means I'm doing okay. Kelly is holding the welcome for me in the background here. And I guess the point I want to drive home here, and I'm probably digressing from sovereignty, but in a culture where you don't have the principle of being born fundamentally evil and needing to be controlled, you don't essentially get an incentive and social structures that encourage control. You get a culture which is focused on knowing who you are, how you contribute to the collective, and being held accountable to do so. And so that's what I use as a design reference to build and understand, protocol-based ethics for technology.